Hello everyone, this is the Skeptical Jelly Bean from the jar. Today I'm going to be taking a look at another PragerU video. This time the subject is evolution. Now this is PragerU, so I expect that they definitely won't misunderstand the most basic concepts of evolution or take the words of real scientists out of context in order to make their points. This should be fun. Let's go ahead and get into it.
Evolution. You learned about it in high school. It goes like this. Life started out with very simple forms, and then gradually, over hundreds of millions of years, morphed into all the forms we see today. Bacteria to Beethoven. Not a straight line, of course, but that's roughly how it went.
Yeah, I'd say that what he described is a roughly accurate elementary school understanding of common ancestry, but to be more precise, evolution is just the change in allele frequency over time. Essentially, it's just genetic changes in populations that occur over time. That's it. The theory of evolution by natural selection is the model of evolution that includes environmental forces selecting for and against certain traits. It's pretty much a model to describe one driving force of evolution. What he's talking about here is, like I said, common ancestry, which is the hypothesis that all life on Earth descended from a single common ancestor that was probably very similar to some kinds of bacteria that we see today. Basically, he's describing one idea that could arise from the subject of evolution, but he's being too narrow with his explanation of evolution as it's understood by biologists.
This was the theory proposed by Charles Darwin in 1859, and with some modification, it's been embraced as unassailable by the scientific community over the last century.
Well, evolution itself is unassailable in that it's an observed fact. As a whole, the theory of evolution by natural selection is pretty unassailable in that it's founded on observed facts. However, no idea in science is unassailable in that it cannot be contested. Anyone with good evidence and peer-reviewed research can oppose any idea. Evolutionary theory, though, is so well supported that it's doubtful that anyone will ever be able to falsify it. It's possible, don't get me wrong, it's a falsifiable idea. It's just unlikely that anyone will ever be able to actually do it. That's just how well supported it is.
As evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins says, if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is either ignorant, stupid, or insane. But is that right?
Yes, it is. Anyone who doesn't accept that evolution happens either doesn't know enough about the subject, doesn't understand the subject, or isn't in a sound state of mind. We know that evolution happens in the same way that we know that grass grows or that dirt can be used to grow plants. It's been observed. I don't particularly like the coarseness of Dawkins in that quote, but it takes all kinds of educators to create an educated world. Some people respond to that, I just prefer a more gentle approach.
Are there no scientific reasons to doubt the evolutionary account of life's origins?
None that I'm aware of. As I said, it's so well-founded that you'd be as likely to prove that the sun revolves around the Earth as you would be to prove that evolution doesn't happen. Hi, this is the Skeptical Jelly Bean in post. When I was making the video, I forgot to mention that evolution doesn't actually try to account for the origins of life. What evolution does is it accounts for changes in populations over time after life begins. Setting evolution up as trying to account for the origins of life is kind of creating a straw man. That's abiogenesis, not evolution.
In November 2016, I attended a conference in London convened by some of the world's leading evolutionary biologists. The purpose? To address growing doubts about the modern version of Darwin's theory.
What do you mean by Darwin's theory? The theory of evolution by natural selection has changed a lot since Darwin's time, and a lot of that change has happened because of our understanding of DNA and genetics. For example, Darwin had no idea where the changes came from or how they were passed on. Thanks to the study of genetics, we understand that genes exist, that they mutate, and that a mutation in a gamete can cause the offspring to have traits that it could pass along to its own offspring. Yes, there were things that Darwin got wrong. We've revised the theory of evolution since then. It's now no more connected to Darwin than the Hyundai Elantra is to Henry Ford. Ford laid the groundwork for the mass production of vehicles, but he didn't really have that much to do with the Hyundai Elantra when you look at how much the designs have changed since his time.
Let's look at just two scientific reasons to doubt this theory. First, the Cambrian explosion. A weird and wonderful thing happened 530 million years ago. A whole bunch of major groups of animals, what scientists call the phyla, appeared abruptly within a geologically short window of time, about 10 million years. These novel animal forms, exhibiting prototypes of most animal body designs we see today, emerged in the fossil record without evidence of earlier ancestors.
Well, yeah, that's kind of what we would expect, regardless of whether or not evolution happened. Most animals before the Cambrian explosion had soft bodies, which doesn't really fossilize well. That's why most fossils that we see are bones or teeth. It's hypothesized that an increase in oxygen allowed animals to have more energy to grow hard body parts like shells and bones. This is where we see arthropods and bony fish develop. Soft body parts usually rot away before they can fossilize, so the appearance of hard body parts would mark the first records of some lineages, regardless of whether or not evolution happened. The fact that we don't see an ancestor in the fossil record for every organism isn't really evidence against evolution. It's what we would expect in any case because of the way fossilization occurs.
Did you catch that? A huge number of diverse animals appeared with no discernible antecedents.
If I see mold on a slice of bread, it's safe to assume that there were mold spores in the bag that came from other mold. Since we know how evolution works, and since we know that we don't expect to see many soft-bodied organisms in the fossil record, this isn't really a problem. Again, we don't need to have an ancestor of every organism in order to be sure that it had one. It's safe to assume that animal species worked in similar ways 500 million years ago as they did 250 million years ago, or 65 million years ago, or even today. You would have to make the assertion that the way animals developed was somehow different during the Cambrian explosion. I didn't see any mold on that bread before isn't a reason to think that there was no mold in the bag, since we know how mold works.
So where did they come from? This question really bothered Darwin, and he acknowledged that he could give it no satisfactory.
Oh no, a biologist from about 140 years ago didn't understand something? That's a death knell for our understanding of evolutionary biology. Seriously though, why do the people who don't accept evolution treat Darwin as if he's some kind of messiah for evolution? He laid down some ideas, he was wrong about some of them. We've moved past Darwin and into the modern day. If you want people to doubt evolution for good reasons, then at least use modern sources for your information. Of course, a person who was laying the groundwork for an area of science didn't understand everything. I wouldn't expect Newton to be able to explain Brownian motion, for example.
Answer. Nor can scientists today. The renowned biologist Eugene Koonin of the National Center for Biotechnology Information describes the abrupt appearance of the Cambrian animals and other organisms, such as dinosaurs, birds, flowering plants, and mammals, as a pattern of biological Big Bangs.
Yes, rapid evolutionary events happen. We understand that, and we understand some reasons behind them. For example, extreme selection pressures. If you read the article that he's talking about, which I've linked in the description, you'll see that the biological Big Bang model just says that there are periods of rapid evolutionary development. It doesn't even address them as problems for evolution. I do suggest that you read the article to see just how out of context this quote really is. Scientists in all relevant fields don't see these biological Big Bangs as a problem for evolution at all.
So what caused all these new forms of life to arise?
Usually environmental changes like increases or decreases in oxygen levels or changes in Earth's climate.
That question leads to a second big doubt, the DNA enigma.
I did some cursory research and I could only find references to the DNA enigma on creationist websites, so I don't think that this is considered a problem by actual biologists. Let's see what he has to say about it though.
In the 1950s, James Watson and Francis Crick made a startling discovery. The DNA molecule stores information as a 4-character digital code. Strings of precisely sequenced chemicals inside the DNA helix store the instructions, the information, for building the crucial proteins that cells need to survive.
Well, it's not really information as much as the basis for a chemical reaction. If it were only important because it can be read as information, then there would have to be trillions of sentient organisms living inside of us reading and interpreting our DNA strands. What we actually see is chemical reactions that produce proteins depending on the DNA structure. It's not really information or a code in the way that he's insinuating.
Unless the chemical letters in the DNA text are sequenced properly, a protein molecule will not form. No proteins, no cells. No cells, no living organisms.
That's true. Now tell me, what would happen if our DNA were not sequenced properly? We wouldn't be able to pass on our DNA. The fact that organisms have functioning DNA says nothing about the cause of that functioning DNA. If functional DNA arose naturally through evolutionary processes and abiogenesis, we would expect to see it propagate itself. If it arose unnaturally, like from some divine creator or something, then we would expect to see the same thing. If our DNA were not functional, then there would be no living things to propagate their DNA, regardless of the cause. The theory of evolution easily explains this. Working DNA reproduces, which means that we would expect to see more organisms with working DNA than non-working DNA. We definitely do. That means that the fact that our DNA works isn't a problem at all for evolution.
Bill Gates has said DNA is like a software program.
Bill Gates is qualified to talk authoritatively about software, but not DNA. If you see an evolutionary biologist compare it to a software program, it's always meant as an analogy. It's not meant literally. It's like a software program in that it programs certain things to happen in your cells. Again, though, it's chemical reactions.
Let's think about that for a second. For computers to run faster and perform more functions, they require new code.
Or it would need to rearrange the code it already has. The alteration of a function can sometimes be more beneficial than the addition of a new function.
Well, the same is true for life. To build new forms of life, the evolutionary process would need to produce new genetic information, new code. But this raises questions about the creative power of natural selection and mutation. Natural selection is a simple sorting process.
In a way, yeah. Natural selection is a process that allows the genes that best fit the environment to be passed on more than those that aren't. It's not inherently a genetic process. Natural selection doesn't really need DNA to work as long as offspring can inherit traits from their parents.
Species keep favorable mutations that allow them to survive, but eliminate bad mutations that cause their members to die out.
In general, yeah, I don't have any major problems with that.
No one doubts that natural selection is a real process, and that it produces minor variations.
Oh, he's not going to get into micro versus macro evolution, is he? I really, sincerely hope not.
But many biologists now doubt that it produces major innovations in biological form.
Oh god, he is, isn't he? Okay, I guess I'll have to deal with it. I wish he would cite a source for that information. I've never heard anything about a biologist making the claim that evolution can't produce major changes in a population over time. Imagine that you have a large bucket of red water. Let's say that you take a pipette and slowly drip in blue food coloring. When does the water become blue? Small changes over time produce big changes. It's not that complicated.
To see why, think again about software. What happens if you introduce a few random changes into computer code? You'll likely mess it up, right? Though it might still work if you don't make too many changes. But if you make enough random changes, your program will stop functioning altogether.
Because computer programs are obviously analogous to genetic changes. Computer code lacks natural selection. If computer programs reproduced, and if random changes in their code did occur, the changes that keep the program from reproducing wouldn't be passed on. The random changes that helped the code reproduce would be passed on. That's natural selection. Sure, in DNA, there are far more potentially negative possibilities for changes than potentially positive possibilities for changes. That's where cancer comes from and why some children are born with birth defects. However, the changes that are detrimental to an animal's ability to reproduce aren't passed on very much, so those changes don't really affect the species as a whole. Basically, DNA isn't directly analogous to computer code in this context because there's no such thing as natural selection for computer code.
You certainly can't keep doing this and expect some cool new program to pop out. There's a mathematical reason for this. In all codes and languages, there are vastly more ways of arranging characters that will generate gibberish than there are arrangements that will generate meaningful sequences. And this applies to DNA. Remember, natural selection only selects sequences that random mutations generate. Yet experiments have established that DNA sequences capable of making stable proteins are extremely rare.
Sure, like I said, there are many more ways to produce dysfunctional DNA than functional DNA. However, we only have to assume that at some point functional DNA formed, and natural selection would take it from there. Obviously, whether you're a creationist or not, DNA formed at some point. That's all you need for evolution and natural selection to happen, whether or not it arose naturally in the first place.
While working at Cambridge University, molecular biologist Douglas Axe showed that for every DNA sequence that generates a relatively short functional protein, there are 10 to the 77th power non-functional sequences. Now consider that there are only 10 to the 65th power atoms in our galaxy. So finding a new DNA sequence capable of building a functional protein is like searching blindfolded for a single marked atom among a trillion Milky Way galaxies.
You've got to keep in mind, though, that there are usually anywhere from thousands to trillions of members of a given species, with millions of places each for a functional protein to form. All it takes is one success within the population for a gene to be passed on in successive generations. I've linked a Professor Stick video in the description with a timestamp for when he responds to this very point, because I think he addressed it better than I can. The rest of this video is basically just a summary of points that I've already addressed. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this response video. If you enjoy my content, consider liking and subscribing, and be sure to check out my other videos. I have videos on epistemology, debate, and other response videos as well, so there's more than one kind of content on my channel. I'll see you guys next time. Toodles!